Right. Good afternoon. Mohammed, welcome back to Emancipation's podcast. It's so nice to see you. Eid Mubarak. Happy holiday. I know it's quite early in Australia, but it's a real joy to welcome you back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Eid Mubarak, and yeah, I'm happy to be back.
So, we have been dealing with over 600 days of this brutal assault on Gaza. Uh, there was a ceasefire in January, which lasted to late March. The Trump uh, effort at diplomacy, if you wish to call it that, through this figure Witkoff, absolutely failed. And we now are back in the full swing of what the Council of Genocide Scholars just announced today is from their position. It took them a year and a half to formally declare it, is in fact now defined by them as a genocide. We have witnessed the rise and fall of an encampment movement in the West that for a while was quite powerful across the university campuses. Um, there's so much to be said. I want to first introduce Mohammed and to just recommend the two prior interviews I did with Mohammed Sulaiman. The first one was about his experience growing up in the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. He reflected on how Hamas came to power when he was doing his exams in high school. And he reflected on his experience as a student of Rafat al-Avir, who was murdered by the Israeli government, I believe, in late December, if I'm not mistaken. The second conversation was dealing with geopolitical issues, more theoretical topics. I think today, Mohammed, we want to focus more on the geopolitics of the situation. I want to first start with my a sense of how difficult this is to discuss this issue for all of us. It's a humanitarian issue in the sense that the sheer number of death is almost too difficult to comprehend. I think for most people, they have, in some sense, tuned out. What are you hearing from your friends, from your family on the ground, and what is the current lay of the land? What's happening right now in Gaza?
Bismillah, sallallahu alaihi. I mean, yes, it's very difficult, obviously, to talk about these issues. I'm from Gaza, so this makes it particularly hard to try and put this into words. But in Gaza, yeah, the situation, as we all know, is quite dire, and that's an understatement. So whatever we say, we really will fall short of trying to grasp the reality of what is happening in Gaza. It's beyond us. We're not part of it. We are mere spectators to the now, again, another word, to the genocide that is happening in Gaza. But what I hear from my family is really now every other day another family member is killed. Yesterday was the latest. My cousin, my female cousin, was killed. So now she's the second sibling of my uncle's family. I've got many uncles, and now I think the number of my family members who have been killed in the genocide exceeds 30, which is really a modest figure. The latest news that I have personally just come across was a massacre in Jabalia a few hours ago. 60 people from the same family were murdered in one airstrike. You might have seen that. So this is the news, and yeah, this is what we all know. Now, what it's like is beyond me to grasp, beyond all of us really to comprehend, because we are not there. and we can try and relate in some way, shape, or form to the agony, to the plight and the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. But it's just impossible, really, to be in that situation for us, because, it's a matter of fact. So I'm not really in a position to try and relay that reality, because I'm not part of it. Obviously, like I said, the news even of family members passing away is quite hard to comprehend. I know many of them. One of them is my namesake, of the same age, Muhammad. I grew up with. I have vivid memories of him, and he was shot dead, sniped, killed by a sniper with a bullet in the head in November last year, as he was trying to evacuate Jabalia after the ill-fated Israeli general's plan, which was followed by the ceasefire. After that military plan collapsed, and now we have another military plan, which is in Arabic, Arabat Gideon's whatever vehicles, or whatever you want to call it, armored vehicles, or tanks. So they keep coming up with those military plans to try and subdue the resistance, to try and control Gaza. And after they realize that it's impossible, they reach some sort of agreement, and then, as always, as is their habit, they break the ceasefire or the temporary agreement, and go back to their old ways of massacring and shedding blood.
One of the things that Muhammad writes about is the role of religion in this particular conflict, which I want to actually introduce in a way which oftentimes we talk about the importance of actually separating the religious from a deeper conceptual understanding of what drives this genocide, what drives this issue, because we can see immediately the way this is abused, distorted, ends up defaming, leading to anti-Semitism. It becomes an issue. However, there is a way to talk about the politicization of religion that I think you have written about. For example, the meaning even of Muslimness in today's world has a distinct political quality to it. And we cannot help but point out the fact that what allows the power, the mechanisms of power to continue this genocidal onslaught is a deep tradition of Islamophobia that's emanating from the West. And I wanted to invite you maybe to say first, if you could, a few things about the context of religion in this particular conflict at this moment. We had addressed this before, but I know that this is something actually that Mohammed, you did your Ph.D. with a focus on political Islam. And it seems to me that we really, really have a lack of a literacy in the West about the way that religion is precisely politicized in the region. It's extremely different than the way Islam looks and feels in the United States, for example. Two different things. Even the difference between the expression of Muslimness in the UK versus the US is extremely different, because there's all of these variables, sociological variables, that go into the expression of Islam. And given that we are speaking on a holy day, thank you also for spending your morning with us. Hopefully you can be with your family and community this afternoon. Would you please tell us, say a few things to give perhaps a conceptual context for our audience on the political role of religion?
Of course, I mean, it's a big question, but it's very important nonetheless. And I'm glad that you raised this question. There aren't many opportunities on the media to engage in this kind of conversation about religion, because it's a taboo topic. People just switch off, don't like to talk about it. It's a personal thing. Like, not that people generally don't like religion. If they do like religion, it's a personal thing. It's a private affair. You just keep it to yourself. You don't like to bring it into the politics because it's divisive, as though the world is united or had been united without religion, and it's religion that actually divides the world. But we'll see. Yeah, I mean, what is religion, right? So that's the first question. I'm not going to try and answer these questions, but I'm just going to try and point out what are the conceptual hindrances, what are the obstacles that make us unable to understand or to diagnose, to describe this situation appropriately and accurately. What is religion? That's the first question we need to ask. Generally, we tend to have this universal idea that religion is something, and we know it by its opposite, and its opposite is politics. So we have religion, we have politics. Whatever is not politics is religion, generally speaking. And religion is, as we said, is a private matter, a private affair. It deals with questions that are empirically unverifiable, with the transcendental, the metaphysical. So it's the opposite of science, because science is, the empirical, the empirically verified, the physical, evidence-based. That's what we say, evidence-based science, and religion is not evidence-based. Of course, we know this criticism has been around for a very long time, since the late 60s and the rise of postmodernism and all of that. Not that I particularly subscribe to those traditions, but they have been quite instrumental in displacing the universality of scientific ways of thinking, as we know, post-scienticism and post-structuralism and so on and so forth. But then, of course, the whole idea of religion that we have seems to have been a legacy of the West. And of course, the question here is, what is the West? And really, if we want to boil down this answer, the answer should be, if we want to speak in geopolitical terms or in geographic terms even, it's Europe. But of course, what is Europe? Because there were many Europes in the past other than the Europe that we know today, because the borders of Europe have also shifted over time. And what is considered Europe now is not what was considered Europe, let's say, centuries or thousands of years ago. So what we talk about here, we talk about Christian Europe. So we talk about a particular conception, a particular map or idea of Europe that is rather modern. So we're talking about Western history, European history, starting with the Reformation, then the post-Reformation, i.e. the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and then, the modern world as we know it. So that's the context, the broad macro historical context within which the idea of religion that we have today must be understood. So, because that context gives us the language, or to use Ludwig Wittgenstein's phrase, the language game. So we have phrases, we have words, and those words only make sense according to the language, to the rules of the language. So when we talk about religion, we talk about this kind of religion that was, again, born out of this genealogy, right? In the Nietzschean sense. The history of ideas, the history of religion, the genealogy of religion is this particular Christian European genealogy, where the church was separated. And then that was the moment at which both religion and politics were born. Because prior to that, there was no religion as such, as a distinct sphere of life, separate from politics, separate from science or art or aesthetics, and so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about Islam, we have a completely different history. Until, of course, the globalization of Europe, or if you wish, until European colonialism and the colonization of the Islamic world, which basically reached its climax with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the division of the imperial domains of the Ottomans into nation states. So that happened basically in the after 1918, in the wake of World War I. Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Accord, according to which they divided the spoils of the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves. And we had basically, there was a line that was drawn almost arbitrarily, and everything north of that line belonged to the French, and everything south of that line belonged to the British. So that means Jordan, Palestine, Iraq went to Britain, whereas Lebanon, Syria went to France. So here we have, this gives us a hint or some sort of a starting point to start thinking about how the world we have today is simply a legacy of European colonialism. Because prior to that, those nation states didn't exist as such, as nation states with those rigid boundaries. What existed was a vast empire that was called the Islamic or the Muslim Empire, which was represented by the Ottomans. And prior to the Ottomans, it was represented by other empires. And all of these empires have basically laid claim to the title of the Caliphate. The Caliphate being the great power that represented the people who belonged to the world of Islam. This, of course, there were divisions in the region. There were many other powers that tried to lay claim to the Caliphate, and they went to war with each other. But what I'm trying to say here is that the public identity of the people who lived in the region was defined by their belonging to the world of Islam, to the religion of Islam. So Islam was and has always been the foundation of political identity for these people in the region. Until again, the region was remodeled according to the example of Christian Europe, where they were divided, again, arbitrarily. And this is also why we have those different ethnicities that simply don't seem to fit within the same nation state. Like we talk about the Kurds, for example, and their almost existence out of place within different countries. We have, all these ethnic and civil wars that emerge, and the macro-political context for all these civil wars in the region is this context, is the lack of a great power that brings more or less some cohesion within the order, the regional order. But instead we have a vacuum. We have nation states, but they're all impotent. They only answer to the powers on the global stage, whether they be Russia, and we saw, for example, in Syria prior to the success of the revolution and the current government, how the Assad regime was simply, an ally of Russia, and that was seen by leftists, and this be obvious here. That was the right choice because it meant that they were standing up to American bullying and American imperialism. But obviously that wasn't good because it also meant a different form of fascism, a different form of, genocide, because that was a genocide as well, on a bigger scale numerically and quantitatively than in Gaza. But again, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Jordan, we have Egypt, and they're simply, allies of American and Western powers. What that means is they're caught up in this situation where they have to, you know, simply they're pitted against each other and they're unable to form their own global power. And that global power, we know, can only be formed on a universal transnational basis that must go beyond those myopic, particular nationalistic identities, which also are the reason why Gaza is in this situation nowadays, because the world and the region cannot come together on an agreement that we have a clear universal enemy, and we have different conceptions of who the enemy is. Is it Israel, for example, or is it Iran or someone else?
So then in the region right now we have a inequality and a issue of a profound, I would say, collective hatred for the rulers across the region. But across the region at the same time, this antagonism amongst the people, how does it express itself? And what are the ways that we might see something like the reemergence of something like an Arab Spring or a kind of regional solidarity? Because if you take Egypt, it borders Gaza, but the Egyptian people have more repression under Sisi, from what I understand, than they did under Mubarak in a certain way, which is a tragedy of the 2011 revolution. So we wonder what the spark would be for something like an uprising, right? I mean, it's very interesting in some sense that if you study what ignited the Arab Spring, it was in some sense the deprivation of material conditions of the people, increase in the cost of bread, for example, was correlated to a lot of uprisings. For example, a sense of dread of having no future for the young people. Could you provide perhaps like a material analysis and then maybe speak about how political Islam is or is not meeting those desires of the people? Is it what might be the future of political Islam as a force for representing the discontent of the masses in this region?
Of course, I mean, all of these issues have their origin in material causes. We're not denying this. What we're talking about is how this expresses itself in ideologies and in, let's say, identities and different worldviews. But it's really hard to predict, obviously, how revolutions occur and when they occur and what sparks them and all of that. Like, no one's before 2011 could have seen or could have predicted the Arab uprisings. And of course, there is a ubiquitous sense of resentment, alienation, deprivation, grievances across the Arab world. And I would say all of it is related to what is happening in Gaza, because these people also appreciate and understand that this is all connected, that the poverty, the poor living conditions that they're in are also related to how Gaza is being treated by Arab rulers, Arab autocracies, and by the rest of the world. And by that we mean, obviously, the world governments. But I think to answer your question about these material causes, we know, for example, like there is also inequality in the West, right? There is inequality in America. And inequality in America, let's say, today is much greater than it was 10 years ago or even 20 or 30 years ago, and that this inequality keeps rising and growing, and that the gap between the rich and the poor keeps increasing. It's the same in Australia, in Britain, across Europe, across, the first world. It's an inherent, we know, logic of capitalism. So the question also is, why is it, I always ask myself as someone who's lived in Australia for many years, why is it that people accept this? Why do they? Because they can see through this, they can see the corruption, they can see that, yes, it's all rules-based and it's all the law, but really, what good is the law if it's just the law of the rich, the law of the powerful, the law that, people in power make the laws to serve their own interests, and then they call it the law. The law, because it's not transcendental law, it's not metaphysical law, it's man-made law. You can change the law. I always ask myself this question. I always tell students, why don't you, they say it's legal. I was like, I don't care if it's legal or not. Should it be legal? You can change it. You can make it illegal. This collapsing of the legal into the moral, and that the legal is sort of the final point of analysis. Like, you cannot go beyond this. You cannot talk about anything as far as it's legal. It's legal. Like, even this in Gaza, sorry, I'm just going a bit off topic, but the same in Gaza when they say, do you condemn Hamas? Because Hamas in this country, for example, is a terrorist organization. I was like, should it be a terrorist organization? Just because it's a terrorist organization, according to your law, doesn't mean it's right. But somehow we have to accept that this is the law. Doesn't mean, because the law has prescribed or has attached this label to an organization, and this is what the law says, then it's somehow God-given, to use religious language between two scapegoats. So really, how is this law different from the law of God or anything else? It's, it's becoming something that is just beyond our ability as human beings to reason with and to contest and to argue. And that's particularly the case for the masses. For the layperson, they just accept it. So when I talk about, to go back to inequality, there is inequality in the West, there is inequality in America, and the question is, why hasn't it yet sparked a revolution, right? And of course, I think the answer is that it's all relative, right? Because people, things will get worse, and only when they get worse, people will start a revolution. But we just have to wait until they get worse and worse, and they keep getting worse until they get to a point where just people are fed up. And I think, honestly, that's nonsense, because that's all relative. What is the point? Who will determine the point that, this is when things are bad enough for people to feel fed up, and that they're willing to actually take action? Because being part of a revolution is also being willing to sacrifice. Because yes, you might not have the best living conditions, but you still get paid, you still have a roof over your head, you still have food on the table. And only when you're willing to sacrifice those crumbs, those bits and pieces that you have, because you say they're not good enough, I'm willing to start a revolution, it's all or nothing, right? Only then does the possibility of a revolution become real. Like, okay, people will then come together and take action. But people are apathetic. They don't want to take action because they're happy with the little that they have. That's the logic. In Australia, people are happy because they say, well, we have it better than, in America or in Britain. We're like, we are 20 years behind Britain. Like in 20 years' time, they say we will be in the same situation as people in the UK are. So we should be grateful for what we have. We should wait until we have it, things get worse for us. But the same logic goes in the UK. And that's what I'm saying. It's all relative. Now let's go to the Middle East. In Egypt, why has there been no revolution? What is it that people are waiting for to start this revolution? And I say this is the same. They're looking around them and they say, well, yes, it's bad. It's very bad. But you know what? It could be worse, right? And I'm talking about countries like Egypt here. I'm talking about, let's say, I don't know. Egypt is probably the worst in terms of, in economic terms, in material terms. Because if you look at the Gulf, I don't think they have a reason to start a revolution. Like in Saudi Arabia, whatever we're saying is simply not applicable because there is almost complete control in terms of ideology around how people think and around their loyalty to the king and to the rulers. Ultimately, the national identity itself is derived from the tribe. So, but there are dissidents, there are many scholars, many leaders in prison. And they're the vocal ones, they're the real leaders, where a revolution, could potentially happen. But again, the vast majority are simply loyal to the king and the crown prince. Now we talk about other countries, let's say North Africa, Morocco. Yes, living conditions are still not great, but they are so much better than other parts of the Arab world. So I think it's hard to provide a clear reason why a revolution hasn't taken place. Once a revolution happens, I think we can then start analyzing why it's happened. But as to why it hasn't happened, I don't think we can really get to the bottom of that.
I wanted to ask your assessment of the solidarity movement outside of the region in solidarity with Palestine. In some sense, it's very impressive the way that the BDS movement, for example, works. They have had many successes. The image of Israel is forever altered for our lifetime after this war, since October 7th. At the same time, there are criticisms that could be put forward, put out onto the table. It's hard to do so because people put their life on the line for Palestine, and we honor them for that, obviously. Could you talk about perhaps your assessment or your observations about the current moment? What more could be done? There is a pessimistic view which says, yeah, these encampments, they don't do anything, etc. I'm not, my own disposition, I don't really hold pessimistic. I don't think that it's really possible or advisable to fall sway to that, what they call black pill. I'm not black pilled. And so that's a sort of a two-part question. How, amongst your colleagues, your friends, fellow Palestinian thinkers and activists, how would you assess this moment right now? Is there room for criticism? How would you give that criticism? What's going well? Maybe what's not going as well at this moment?
Yes, I think, there has been a lot of great work on the international scale in terms of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I think it's inevitable for this to happen. And I think it's important that this continues, of course. I don't think it's enough. But at the same time, I don't think more can be done or qualitatively different work can be done. So more can be done in terms of actions, encampments, protests, rallies, speeches, interviews. But I don't think that's going to change the outcome or the course of events. That's not going to be the decisive factor. That's an important element of the war, because that's a war. That's how we should talk about this. It's a war, and because we're talking about action, so what more can be done? I think people have been taking a lot of action, and we saw some of those extreme and revolutionary, truly revolutionary actions taken by individuals, regardless of what normative value you want to ascribe to the word revolutionary. But they are revolutionary because they're not normal actions. They're not your everyday actions when, people, for example, set themselves on fire as a form of protest, or when people simply decide to sacrifice their freedom, their life, to sort of make a statement by engaging in a way of sort of in a form of violence, where this violence simply is no longer confined to Gaza, because it's about Gaza, but it's no longer confined to the geographic boundaries of Gaza. It's simply the globalization of the war, where everybody sees themselves as an actor in the war. And we saw that as well with the attack on the two Israeli diplomats 2 weeks ago now. So I think these are all revolutionary actions, because again, they're not normal actions. They're not actions that you see every day, and they also help bring light, or sort of focus our attention on the severity and the gravity of what is happening in Gaza, and how this is something that cannot be contained to the local sort of region or to Gaza itself. But of course, there are other less extreme actions, your weekly protests, your rallies, your, social media activity, your voices, criticisms, student encampments, student protests, at graduation ceremonies, all of that. That's all important, because again, it makes you part, and ultimately you're making a statement about yourself and about where you stand in relation to this world-defining event, because that's a world-defining event. That's an event out of which a new world order is inevitable to arise and is beginning to arise, as everybody should be able to see this. We have seen this now in America. We see like this theater in America where, we have people in power, and we just really wonder how this world order is based around power in the hands of individuals such as Musk and Trump. But regardless, what I'm saying is that these are important actions, but they are not the decisive factor, because the decisive factor will always remain local. It will remain Gaza and what is happening in Gaza. So it's a war, and in this war, it's become a war of elimination. So for the Israeli side, victory can only be achieved by the elimination of the Palestinian people, or at the least of the resistance, i.e. the militant groups in Gaza, or militants in Gaza, mainly Hamas and Islamic Jihad groups. Now, because it's a war of elimination, it also requires that the Israeli side subdue the will of the Palestinian people to fight. Until that has been achieved, it's impossible. We cannot say that this war has concluded, because that's the goal of the war for the Israeli side, to simply end the Palestinian willingness to fight, to use arms in its struggle against Israeli.
Is that ever in the realm of possibility, in your view, that they would be able to achieve that?
It's never been, and it
Never
will
will be.
not be. It's just cannot happen. It's impossible to happen. You have 2 million people in Gaza. That's why the only way that Israel can actually win this war is by literally, it's a war of elimination, and it requires for Israel to win, to kill the 2 million people that live in Gaza. That's the only way Israel can win this war. And that's why it's impossible. That's where the international part of the war, the international aspect, what we call solidarity, is important, because it's on them to make sure that this doesn't happen. It's on them to make sure that the governments keep watching and they put enough pressure on the Israeli side to stop acting lawlessly, because it's a war, but it should be guided by rules. There are laws. And war in itself is not necessarily, the war exists because it's a fact of life, it's a fact of politics. Wars have always existed. They will always exist. The point is, when wars happen, how do we fight them? That's why we have the Fourth Geneva Conventions. That's why we have international humanitarian law, not international law. For those who are not well versed in law, it's international humanitarian law, which is the law of war, which is we will fight. We are nation states, and there's always the ever-present possibility of war, that we will go to war with each other. But when we go to war with each other, let's be civil. The point is, they call this part of the world barbaric, and this part of the world has shown itself, and I talk about Hamas, to be much more civilized than this civilized world in its way, in the way it's conducted the war. And again, I have no qualms always showing the disparity between the Israeli way, the Israeli conduct in the war, and Hamas conduct in the war. And I think the world has also been able to see this with it, for example, the treatment of the hostages and so many other things. Again, not saying Hamas hasn't committed particular acts, because of course it's a war in the end. But again, we're talking about, how when it comes to this war, I think international solidarity is important, but it must also understand its role in this war of genocide.
So let's
supplementary.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about Islamophobia as a background condition, because I do think from a more abstract point of view, it behooves us to ask the question, why is this permitted in the West to persist? My neighbor happens to be affiliated with an Arab American, what's called anti-discrimination nonprofit organization. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Arab American community actually leaned towards Trump in the election last November in certain regions because of what the Democrats allowed to happen in Gaza, of course. And he's actually a leader of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. And I was surprised to see him express optimism initially. And then we got a ceasefire. What was the status of Hamas from the moment of the ceasefire? We saw what happened in Lebanon with Hezbollah, the retrenchment of Hezbollah, but how is Hamas now reconfigured now that we have reinitiated the war from the ceasefire moment? Have they strengthened? Can you say anything about their status in any way you're comfortable to?
About Hamas in particular and its position in the war?
And it's a strategic, because we do have to recognize Norman Finkelstein. I was listening to an interview with him, and he said, "Are you aware of how many Israeli soldiers die per day?" And he said, on average, only one, And so in this sense, the asymmetry, the David-Goliath dynamic cannot be denied. It cannot be overlooked. And I think that has led many specialists, or maybe let's say intellectuals in the West, to say, really, this is a genocide precisely because of this imbalance in the death toll, right? I don't think that you hold that perception. Why don't you hold that perception? And can you elaborate perhaps maybe more on that?
Yes, of course. You can hold the two positions, that this is a war of genocide and that it's a war. A genocide is by definition a war. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying, people, again, I think there is this also lack of literacy around those terms. They say it's a genocide, so it's not a war. A genocide is a war. It's a war of genocide. That's what it is. That's the definition of it. That's what it's called. So it's a war of genocide, but a war requires two parties. So we have a party, the party that is perpetrating the genocide, and we have a party against whom the genocide is being perpetrated. For us, we want to think, and I'm sorry, this is also Islamophobic. And, now I'm going to be a bit blunt. I've been really trying to mince my words, but I'll be blunt now. Also, this is Islamophobic, that, Palestinians are facing genocide, so they should stop fighting. Okay, just face the genocide and stop fighting. Okay, accept that you're in genocide. Don't kill one soldier per day. It's not enough soldiers you're killing. I don't get it. Okay. Yeah, there is a disparity. There is a discrepancy. It's a war of genocide. I'm in this situation. What do you want me to do? Okay, I don't have weapons. The world abandoned me. The Arabs abandoned me. Everybody, everyone is watching as my children get massacred. My buildings, my houses get, razed to the ground. All kinds of weapons get tested on me. And, here I am. You want me just to drop my weapons and raise a white flag and walk to the Israelis and say, here you go, take over? Or should I keep fighting? Oh, but if you keep fighting, they'll bomb you more. Yeah, and if I don't fight, they're not. Isn't that the same logic of the Zionists in the first place, that, we do this because you fight? So that's where I'm saying, if you really want to come to terms with what is happening in Gaza, it's a war. And there are two sides to it, two warring parties. Israel on the one hand, and the Palestinians. The majority of the Palestinians who are getting killed, 99% of them are people without guns. Because, it's a densely populated place, and you are dealing with a barbaric enemy who pays absolutely no regard to law, and who's willing to do it. And also, they're weak and vulnerable, and they cannot fight. They can kill, but they cannot fight. They can kill because it's a free supply of weapons. They don't even have to pay for those weapons. They just get them for free. Or if they have to pay them, it's not their money anyway. So it's, why not? Just bomb. It's an easy war for them. But you can make it hard for them. You can make them pay a heavy price. And the only price they can pay is the lives of their own soldiers who come to commit massacres and war crimes against your own families. What do? You try and defend yourself by any means necessary, in any way you can. And in fact, Hamas has proven itself to be very effective in doing this, and it's exceeded the expectations of all military analysts and strategists. Who has expected Hamas to last 600 days under this, within those, conditions, under those circumstances? So for someone to come and say, well, are you aware how many soldiers Hamas kill or are killed in Gaza every day? Only one. The question is, why is Israel still fighting in Gaza? Why? That is the question. Why hasn't this war ended? If it's not important, if Hamas is not important, right? And Hamas is not actually effective as a warring party, as an actor, because we're talking about action, talking about political action. And we think this is the liberal in us that we still cannot free ourselves from, right? We think, oh, I want to take action. I want to protest. I want to speak up. I want to do an interview or go on social media. That's all interesting action, but the real action, the severe action, the extreme action that we saw in for example, that I was referring to, when someone sets themselves on fire, because that's being part of the war. That's like an extreme. That's also action. Again, it's up to you to attach whatever normative value. My job is to describe, not to say this is good or bad. Diagnosing what's happening. And the highest form of political action is war. That's why we said we have organized communities. We have, America. Why does America have an army? Can't you just get rid of your army? Why do you need it? Why do you have to spend so much on it? Why do you have to spend most of your annual budget on it? Just explain it to me. Because you're ready for war anytime. Why, do all countries around the world do the same? Well, that's okay for other countries, but it's not okay for people who have no nation state and who have lived under occupation and under colonialism for so many decades to have some form of organized military action. Of course, they need it more than anybody else. And they're going to use it when it matters. And now they're using it. Yes, we see that it's becoming less effective, but in fact, only yesterday, there were four major military operations across the Gaza Strip. It's only in the aftermath of those events that Israel feels enough pressure to sit at the negotiating table, because that increases the volume of pressure within Israel, because Israelis are watching their own news, right? And they look and they see, okay, dead soldiers, wounded soldiers. What are we doing in Gaza? What are we even trying to achieve? We're achieving nothing. We're only sending our best men, our best people, and then they lose their lives for nothing in Gaza. So the only way this war can actually end is through military action. But this requires international support. This requires support and pressure from governments on the Israeli side, because the Israeli side doesn't feel that they are, they have to do anything. They can just keep killing. So this is the least we can do. I'm just trying to show how these things are connected. Our actions are important, but really, they're not going to end it. They're going to facilitate and to expedite this into the war, hopefully.
I wanted to ask your thoughts on Yemen, or the outlier, the courageous Yemeni people. You really have to admire the positions that they take. In a way, I also want to ask you, I mean, first off, my sense is, coming from the perspective of a socialist, it feels like we're repeating the 1970s in a sense, because Gaza is the central pulse of global struggle at this moment. That sends out reverberations regarding how we conceptualize contesting power, and therefore we internalize this war psychology, and there is in a way some incommensurability across borders when that happens. So how I see these acts of extreme violence in the West is, I don't endorse them, but I'm not going to pretend that they are aberrations or something like that. I see them as, unfortunately, inevitable, even though strategically I'm not necessarily going to endorse it. But would you like to see more examples like Yemen? And what accounts actually for the Yemeni spirit, as it were, or their solidarity? Because it seems to me it must be a question perhaps of their leadership. Because it's not to say that other nations don't have that same solidarity. They do, but they don't have the leadership. Would you see it that way in terms of their role in this conflict? And they've been paying the price. They've been paying the price. They've been being bombed.
Yes, it's important to talk about the Yemeni factor, for sure. Now, I agree, it's the leadership that's making the difference in Yemen. But it's not just the leadership. There's something unique about the Yemeni situation, about the Yemeni people in general. Of course, they're Arab, they're Muslim, and in fact, they're the first Arabs. They're the actual Arabs. Like Arabs originated in Yemen before Saudi Arabia. Arabs populated Yemen and started in Yemen. So Yemenis take pride in the regional Arab leadership. They see themselves as regional Arab leaders, even culturally at least, and linguistically, and in aesthetically, and in terms of literature, all of that. Yemenis always are at the forefront in terms of history and their place in history in the Arab world. But of course, it's the leadership that's facilitating and sort of making them play a prominent role in solidarity with Gaza. But it's not just the leadership, because when we talk about the leadership, this is where people, okay, it's because it's Yemeni, it's the Houthi leadership, it's the Shia leadership. No. Hezbollah, right, in Lebanon, which is geographically adjacent, closer to Gaza and adjacent with Palestine, had a much more, had much more reason to be involved in the war in Gaza before the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, the ceasefire. And they didn't do as much, anywhere near as much as the Yemenis did, right?
Why is that?
Yeah, that's where I'm talking about the uniqueness of the Yemeni people. And it's not just about the Shia because they're Shia and they're revolutionary and it's the axis of resistance. It's Iran plus Hezbollah plus former Assad Syria plus Yemen. That's an axis. That's nonsense.
Secondary, yeah.
Yeah, that's not really the case. Because we saw Iran, ultimately, it's a nation state. And it only plays, it does politics according to its own national interests, right? Same with Hezbollah. It's a non-state actor within Lebanon, but it's confined by the national state sort of interests and boundaries. But with the Yemenis, that's all gone. They're miles away, they're separated, but at the same time, they insist on the solidarity. And like I said, the reason is, as Yemeni people, they see themselves as, there is this inherent revolutionary spirit in them, which is very similar to that in Gaza, to the spirit in Gaza. But at the same time, I think it's perhaps there are other agenda, for example, with the Houthis, because they're not particularly very popular internally. But when they take action against the external enemy, against Israel, then they're able to go beyond all those divisions internally. Because like I said, there are many Yemenis who have been victimized by the Houthis. There are many Yemenis, and I've heard this in interviews by prominent Yemeni scholars and politicians who explained the Houthis in this way, saying that a lot of people look at the Yemen and the Houthi and they see a victimizer because of how they rose to power, and because they rose to power in a bloody battle in Yemen in which they seized control. Now, they see in the Houthi a victimizer. They see in the Houthi a brutal ruler. But at the same time, when they see their actions against Israel, then they're able to put that aside and just, work or act as a collective, because the Yemenis, for them, solidarity with the Palestinian people. And again, that's probably sort of begging the question also, why is that? And like I'm saying, I think it's something that's inherent in the Yemeni people, that, the spirit of revolution, particularly against foreign invasion, and particularly against non-Muslim foreign invasion, because Yemenis also are deeply rooted in Islamic history. And like I said, in the Arab world in general, pre-Islam, but also after Islam. For example, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ migrated from Mecca due to oppression in the early phases of Islam, he wanted to migrate. He wanted to leave Mecca and go to a place where he could be safe and start his community. And there were many options. And the closest option, the one that would have made more sense, was Yemen. And but of course, he chose Medina. And then he sent an envoy to Medina to basically get a sense of how people would receive him in Medina. And then he had a companion with him in Mecca who said, no, rather than go to Medina, come with us to Yemen. And we would do anything. We would sacrifice everything to host you, to protect you, and for you to start your community. But of course, people in Medina were also receptive and welcoming of the Prophet. So he went to Medina. So the idea is, if he didn't go to Medina, if the Prophet ﷺ didn't go to Medina to start his community, that community would have started in Yemen. Islam would have started and would have been built and established and would have grown in Yemen. So I think there is that sort of historical, cultural element, and also the Yemeni people being free people, like their way of living, I think just makes them who they are in terms of being just unruly, difficult to control, just like the Palestinian people in Gaza. No one has ever occupied Yemen, for example. Yemen has never been occupied. All these wars in Yemen, all this poverty, the starvation, these wars just cannot break the will of the Yemeni people. And in that sense, they are very similar to the Palestinians.
Thank you for that. That's very powerful. I wanted to ask you what your friends and colleagues and extended network in Gaza are saying about Eid, the holiday right now. What is it like to celebrate Eid with everything we know about what they have had to endure from the blockades, the deprivation of food, the food crisis, and the constant paranoia and fear of the bombings and so on? What are you hearing people say about this holy day and what it's like?
It's the fourth Eid in genocide. That's how they talk about it. They say that's the fourth Eid now in a row in genocide. So now, that's the thing I see the most when I look at people's posts and hear from people. But at the same time, I think it's a very sad Eid. That's the truth. It's very melancholic, very sad, very tragic, sorrowful. So many martyrs on the first day, so many people killed. But at the same time, there is, as it's always been, it's a war. A lot of people are getting killed, but there is good news for the Palestinians. 4 major military operations. That's what I see personally. I see people celebrating this. I see people saying, we are here. Like I said, there is a huge military ambush in Khan Yunis in the south. A special military force was invading and trying to ambush a Palestinian militant group, but they fell into their own ambush and they got into a building. The building was basically an ambush, as I said, and it was, it exploded. Every one of that unit, 12 soldiers, 12 personnel, were between either killed or injured. And then according to Israeli press, 5 soldiers were killed just in that event, just in that one event. Then that was followed by 3 major events as well. So in Jabalia, in Beit Lahia, so further north, we're talking about areas still very close to the line to the border, to the fence between Israel and Palestine. So even those areas are still beyond control by the Israeli army. They haven't controlled those areas, let alone invade deep, let alone control deeper inner areas within Gaza. So this war, I cannot see how it's going to end militarily or in terms of a win for the Israeli side. But again, in terms of Eid, this is what people are talking about. They're living this. This is the daily news, the daily updates. Bombing here, people massacred here, looking for food anyway. And just following resistance updates and all of that.
I want to bring in a bigger picture about how in the West, the view of Islam in particular contributes to allowing, to making permissible the genocidal aspect of the war. I think you've made a strong case that this has to be thought as both a war in a traditional sense, despite the asymmetry of power involved, as well as a genocide. And I would contend that there is a social phenomenon stretching back to the Crusades time that's very, very profoundly deep. And I have actually worked a lot personally on this issue of how could we address, and I mean, let me be clear also that I think there's a strong liberal misnomer about the very meaning of a stereotype or a discrimination, as if it is sort of just like a wrong perception that education could correct. No, 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 that's not accurate. If that were true, then everyone at the elite universities would be very welcoming to Muslims, and because they're so educated, they could read about Islam, they could read the truth. Things don't function that way. The discrimination is linked to systems of domination, to systems of power. I would in fact say that maybe education muddies the water even more when it comes to the perception of Muslims and Islam in some sense, because the imperatives of the US empire necessitate the residual invention of the Muslim other who would be eligible for annihilation. So how can we create an image of the Muslim in the minds of the masses that would not permit this annihilation to even be thought, to even be allowed, right? This question of the protection of minorities and the double standard involved is very, very pronounced when it comes to Palestinian lives, right? Can you walk us through how you see this issue of the double standards when it comes to Palestine, maybe even amongst liberals, right? Liberals who would have an ease to use of a pro solidarity with victims, with minorities, with religious minorities, ethnic minorities, racial minorities. All of that gets thrown out the window when it comes to Palestine. Why is that? Why is that the case? And what maybe are the ways that you would see we could address Islamophobia? I know that, like, even Edward Said, who, as a side point, and then I'll let you answer, the most comments that I got, by the way, from our first interview revolved around for young listeners, how unique your criticism of Edward Said thought was to them, by the way, just as a side point. People felt that they had never heard a criticism of Edward Said as you had put forward on my show. But of course, the criticism is not is in full knowledge of his immense contributions. It's not like that. Talk about Islamophobia, please.
I think that's very important to talk about, and I think you just made me think of Mahmoud Mamdani's book Good Muslim Bad Muslim, which is a well-known book on this topic, Good Muslim Bad Muslim, and also the manufacturing of good Islam, cosmopolitan Islam that the Abrahamic religion,
liberal,
the Islam,
moderate,
exactly. A colleague of mine, Yasser Musi, also wrote a book.
We don't hear that phrase much anymore. Did you notice that? It's very interesting.
True, because everyone is assumed to be moderate unless they're Hamas sympathizers. So it's interesting. Honestly, there's so many thoughts. I'm not sure where to start, but I think it's important. If we want to talk about Islam, like I said, then we talk about religion. Then we have to understand what religion is. And once we put religion in its place, we know that this category is a Western category. That's your religion. That's what you understand by religion. And then some people will come back and say, so your religion, there is no separation between Islam and between religion and politics. And I was like, again, you're imposing your category. You're saying there's no separation. That this is the Orientalists. It's a legacy of the Orientalists. They've done so much damage, these people, over so many decades of scholarship that it's hard for us to break free from the knowledge that they have bequeathed us, and they still write about Islam and Muslims in this way. And of course, a lot of Muslims nowadays use these categories and, perpetuate this idea that there is radical Islam, moderate Islam. And I'm not saying there are no radical, or whatever that word means. This is where language is a prison. It's hard to talk because you are a prisoner of the language that is now so powerful
And
and hegemonic.
the moderate label was actually invented by, I think, the Rand Corp. It was a State Department think tank that was hired by State Department to invent this dichotomy, and then the State Department pushed it, and that's why people talked about it a lot more, because under Obama, Obama tried to unite the quote unquote Muslim world and insert that division internal to Muslim identity, whatever have you. But what I find so interesting is that there's no legitimacy that the Western states can't do that anymore. Legitimately, or anybody that would work with them. I'll give you an example. They used to have this thing like the White House Eid dinner, and I think it's been canceled for quite a while. I mean, especially under Trump, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not room for compliments.
but I mean, Salman Saeed is correct about the inescapability of Muslimness as being associated with the political in our time. And I think that actually is very difficult for many people to maybe accept that fact. The imminent politicization of everything, it's crazy.
Yes, true. And yeah, Islam, like I said, I also like Salman's phrase. We're talking about Salman Sayyid here, Sayyid, for those who don't know, rather than Saeed. And his book, A Fundamental Fear, and his other book, Recalling the Caliphate, in which he sort of puts forward an argument about Islam being inherently political. But of course, we have a particular understanding of the political, right? Not politics as nation state politics, right? Because that's again liberal Westphalian legacy that, politics is just what the state does. There's no politics outside the state or anything that's just associated with the state. So that's also the tragic flaw of political Islam, that it fell into this trap. When it wanted to do politics, it had to do politics within the nation state template. And that's why it carried the seeds of its own failure. That's Olivier Roy's argument, the French scholar who thinks of himself as non-Orientalist, but I would argue is just
I read your review of his book. It's funny because he's a very clever writer. Like he's intelligent. But I agree with you that the models and paradigms that he's working with are maybe outmoded or outdated.
Yeah, because he talks about his book, The Failure. Now it was published first in 1994. The failure of political Islam is an inevitable failure, that all political Islamist movements are doomed to fail before they even start or before they rise. Ultimately, it's a logical, philosophical failure, Again, because it assumes that the only way political Islam can work is within the nation-state model, which is or has been the case with the past and existing Islamist movements. But that's because we have a very myopic understanding of politics, in which we think of politics as what? As governance. And that also brings me to a critique of a book we mentioned before, I think more privately, Politics, Law and Community by Andrew, in which also reduces politics to a matter of, how do we form a government? But before you start forming a government and talk about how you govern your society and your community, shouldn't you talk about how you establish your community rather than take for granted that your community is pre-existing? Where are the Muslims? When you talk about governing Muslims, which Muslims? Where are they? So there is this idea that the community is the new transcendental signified, the new pre-existing self-subsistent pre-given category. It's just there. Where are they? I say, there are Muslims, but there is no Muslim community. There are Muslim individuals, disparate, atomistic. They are there. But where is the Muslim community as a political community, as a represented political community? Because the only way a Muslim community can exist as a represented political community is when you have a political foundation for it. And a political foundation requires power. And that's action. But we want to jump ahead and just start talking about what? Governance. Right or wrong, halal and haram. How do we do this in America? That's why Muslims ended up voting for Trump, because it's a dilemma. What else are you going to do? Vote for Biden? No, you're caught in this. I was talking about Salman Sayyid's phrase, Islam is a scandal. In the world today, Islam is a scandal. Because it has no representation. It's diaspora. It's a state of metaphorically, it's a state of diaspora. All Muslims are in a state of diaspora until they have political representation on the world stage. And this state of diaspora is best represented in the genocide in Gaza. Why is this happening? Because there's no one to stop it. This is where, if you use not that I would agree that I am pessimistic, but this is why no one has been able to stop the genocide in Gaza, because international action is not international. What international action? Unless there's an international war on Israel, what would that look like? I don't get it. So when we say we want to stop the genocide, how are we going to stop it? Like, flotilla, or let's sail toward Gaza. So this is going to stop the genocide. Again, I appreciate that you're risking your life. But let's be honest. Is this going to stop the genocide? Is this going to stop one baby from getting killed in Gaza? What is going to stop the bloodshed in Gaza? A counterpower, a military power. It's logic, right? It's, I don't get what's so radical about this, and why is it hard for people to accept, to subscribe to this idea that what the region lacks is political power. Unified political power. And the only way this unified political power can be enacted is by going back to the roots, the history of the region. What is the history of the region? And these are the same roots of Islamophobia, because this is how Europe formed its own history, its own idea, its own image. This is where we talk about the Crusades and before the Crusades. And, where Europe was always in an existential conflict with what? With Islam, because it's, the only power that managed to invade, conquer, and dominate the Christian world for many centuries. And these are part of our, knowledge. When we talk, when we write, when we read our own history, even subconsciously, Islam is the other, whether we like it or not. It is the other. It is, it's the exotic. This is where Edward Said has given us all the knowledge again about how Islam is represented. Not because these are malicious people who want to portray Islam as, a bad, threatening sort of entity, but indeed, in the past, Islam had posed a significant threat to Christian imperial domains, right? So when people in the West read about their own history as Christian history, they read about this other that's coming and invading and, controlling and ruling and all of that. And then they have this idea that, now we rule them. But we're better than them because we accept them or whatever. But again, that's only, we know half of the story, because the real story is that Islam, when it ruled Europe was, a huge civilization in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted and lived, as equals. That's the truth. And then I'm not going to go there, but people will bring up jizya. They had to pay, the tax because you didn't have to take part in the war.
Right.
Muslims had to go and fight for you.
Right. No, I mean, what you're saying is very powerful, because in a certain way, there's also an Islamophobia that is textual, where the argument is there's actually something that distinguishes Islam from Judaism and Christianity, which oh, the treatment of women, it cannot adapt to modernity. Any Islamic state will be regressive, etc., etc. Like this is the argument of this kind of a perverse textualist view that still has some purchase in the West, of course, mostly in far right wing, like Christian evangelical, far right wing Catholic perspectives. But those perspectives still are mobilized to influence state policy, because the state policy is tied to geopolitical interests, and so they're going to use that as a supplement of justification, as a model of a narrative of justification, to do what they need to do to extract the resources in the Muslim lands, etc., and to keep these people pacified. But what you're talking about is a kind of, as I understand it, almost like it's not so much about understanding Islam from this textualist position, but it's about understanding the sedimentation and the kind of interlinkage of Islam as a classical tradition of theology and of the Sharia, of fiqh, of jurisprudence, and all of that. But also what we neglect is the lived, embodied, experiential way that Islam can fuse. Like, it's interesting even to draw a parallel to the Yemeni spirit, because what Salman Sayyid's work evokes in me is the sense that, well, Pakistan didn't use Islam effectively when it created the nation state, and it actually adapted. There has not been a proper use, according to him, of how to fuse Islam with a true political project. In some sense, he claims that hasn't really happened. Yet at the same time, maybe you could talk about the reality of the fact that a lot of Muslim, or let's say political Islamic expressions, are weighed down with heavy sectarianism, corrupt leadership. Look, the Syria example, for example, the status of the Muslim Brotherhood is another example. Is your vision something almost like that would exceed these petty sectarian rivalries? Is there a vision of the fusion of Islam that would be different than that could transcend that? Is it naive to think that something like that could be transcended, these sectarian dimensions, what Salman calls politics or the antik, this kind of? I'm inviting you to maybe reflect more on that. I know it's a very abstract question, but please.
No, it's all very thought-provoking, of course. Listen, I don't know like how feasible this project is, right? I was told by a reviewer of my own work, that I remind them of Black pessimists, African pessimism, when I write about Islam. Yeah.
Frank Wilder's Afro-pessimism, right.
Afro-pessimism, right. Yeah. Because I provide this diagnosis of the state of the Muslim world, of the history, and the current situation, and but then so it's kind of, it leads to nothing.
Well, that's interesting, because I read Salman as having a strategy. Salman is actually very, very practical, actually, in fact.
Well, I come from Gaza, so I think that also shapes how I how I do scholarship, in terms of like, what is my purpose of producing scholarship? What is my purpose of writing or of reading? Like, really, do I want to envision ways that I feel perhaps, at an embodied level, viscerally feel are just not really reachable, like models that are not realistic? They make sense on paper, but in reality, as someone, who's sort of had particular upbringing, experiences, and, currently witnessing the genocide of his own people, perhaps that should be a motive to try and think of a way to, counteract that and sort of resist that. But at the same time, it's also and it would be wise to come to terms with reality, not to accept defeat as such, but at the same time to, thank you, Eid Mubarak, but at the same time to think of how the situation that we're in is not accidental. It's by design that we are here. Of course, what that requires is that we form and envision ways to counteract that. Now, you were asking about the Muslim world itself and the sectarianism that is life within the Muslim world, and I think that is a symptom of the problem. Of course, also we have to acknowledge that sectarianism in the Muslim world has started. It started. Some people would say that, when it started is immediately after the death of the Prophet, because we know with the fitna, with the death of the Prophet, and, the question of who should be the caliph, and that's where we already have the beginning of sectarianism, the beginning of division within the Muslim world, right? But I would say Muslims have been able to overcome this division by agreeing, because ultimately you're never going to have full agreement. Even in America, for example, you have a president. Any country, you're never going to have, in any political situation, you're not going to have full consensus. But what you can have is relative stability, right? That's what we can aim to achieve: relative stability, relative order. We can try and achieve relative order. We're not going to have full order, because that's how it's going to be. Well, there was a caliphate, there was a Muslim power, but there was still oppression, there was injustice, there was all of that. And I was like, yes, of course, and there will always be that. Unless you have this kind of utopia, which by definition is a utopia, it's an ideal, cannot be fulfilled, or unless you're living at the time of the Prophet as a Muslim. That's what I think. But unless, and that's not the case, so you're always going to have a relative degree of injustice, corruption, and all of that. But what you aim to achieve is maximum order, and maximum order is always going to be relative. You're going to have to achieve maximum peace and prosperity, but that's always going to be relative, right? Now, what we're asking ourselves, in the current Muslim world today, we have so much corruption, so much injustice, oppression, alienation, all of these things. Can we be in a better situation? Can this be improved? Can we better our own condition? And what can be done? And we're offering this pathway, at least theoretically, saying all of this is because, you have to understand the macro history, world history. You cannot just go back 20 or 30 or 50 years. You have to understand the history of the entire region. You have to understand yourself as a Muslim and your relationship to the other, right? Because let's look at Gaza. When we look at Gaza, what do we see? We see Muslims, we see Palestinians. But what also do we see? We see Muslims. Can you see Palestinians in Gaza without seeing Muslims at the same time? And please, I don't want any of those responses. Oh, but there are Christians in Gaza. Of course there are Christians in Gaza. Maybe 1,000, maybe less. I'm not sure.
You think it's that small?
But really,
it's pretty small.
That's, of course, very small. The point is, so what are you saying? That proves the point that they're just Muslim, mainly Muslim. Muslims. So you see Palestinians, but you see Muslims at the same time. Because when you look at them, in their performativity, how they how they live their life, they live, as Muslim. And of course, this has brought back Islam to the fore in terms of the conversation about the Middle East. First in the region itself, those who have expressed solidarity and support for the Palestinian people are mostly driven by their connection with Palestinians as Muslims. So the ones who are still deeply rooted in the political tradition of Islam, I'm not saying political Islam, I'm saying in the political history of Islam, this has been the main driving factor of solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza, because they see those as oppressed Muslims. And this is where, you go back to classical Islam and also post-classical Islam, if we want to talk about, let's say, Ibn Taymiyyah himself, it's oppressed Muslims under oppression, and particularly by non-Muslims, by the enemies of Islam, because this is what it is. But now, oh, that's too radical. You're talking about Islam and politics and enemies of Islam. That sounds like, extremist language, but it's just factual language. This is factual language. And I'm saying Muslims outside the region, even in the West, in America, in Australia, in Britain, express solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Most of them are not Arabs. In fact, most of the Muslims in the US, probably, and I haven't been, who are vocal about their support with Palestinians in Gaza are probably non-Arabs. But they express, because the Arabs are a minority within Muslims in the first place. We have to recognize that Arabs constitute what? Less than, I'm not even sure what the figure is, but I think there are about 280 million Arabs, between 250 and 280 million, which is probably the population of Pakistan or Bangladesh, just one country of a Muslim non-Arab country. So most Arabs are a minority. It's not about Arabs. Islam is the driving factor here of support and of solidarity with the Palestinians, because they are seen correctly as Muslims under oppression. And that needs to be capitalized on as a basis for mobilizing, for envisioning politics based on Islam. That's what I think people should be doing, to try and, again, if you think about Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia has witnessed the largest mass protests. I'm not sure currently what's going on, but I've seen, the sentiment is 100%. Of course, people are probably now distracted by their everyday lives and all of that, and by the geographic distance. But if you're Palestinian, Indonesia is definitely one of, in fact, in Australia, I know that it's Indonesian influence that stopped Australia from recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Wow.
Because of the economic trade relations
Right.
between Indonesia and Israel.
They pressured them, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And why? And it's free for a Palestinian to go to Indonesia without a visa. Not many countries grant you that, particularly not Arab countries would let a Palestinian. So
do you
Turkey,
think that a spontaneous revolution, that going back to our earlier conversation about this, will inevitably touch and be infused with a new relationality to Islam, and that will then propel a new identification amongst the people with the religion? That's one question. And another question I had was, how do you get outside of or transcend the repression that people impose upon the politicization of Islam? Because I know this as a Marxist, people have so many misconceptions about Marxism. Sometimes I'm like, well, actually, let's just go back to like square one. What are we really trying to do? We're not, it's not all like, it's, on the one hand, it's Marxism is not conflatable with centrist liberalism. On the other hand, it's not anarchism. So it's like, it has to be defined in its own essence. It's very hard to do that with Islam, I feel, because of these, because of the force of the state apparatus and how controlling it is. Do you have any advice to people that may be struggling with this balance? Because on the one hand, the Western view of religion is, it's personal, it's spiritual. It's like, you could go be a Buddhist, just treat it like self-help, treat it like losing weight or some kind of self-improvement. No. But then if I want to be politicized, that's something separate. And what you're saying is, in fact, no, unfortunately, this is not. Well, fortunately, this is not how it's to be understood. But still, nonetheless, people struggle with that. And I would assume maybe many young people struggle with that. Would you have any advice on that issue?
It depends. Like, so we're talking about non-Muslims or Muslims?
Maybe both. I mean, maybe both. I don't know
Because
because I feel
it differs. I will have a
it
different
differs.
answer. Yeah.
I mean, in a certain sense, I almost feel like in Christianity, sometimes it feels almost like impossible, like an impossible hurdle to politicize elements of Christianity. But maybe that's not true with Islam. Maybe Islam actually is unique. And I feel like Salman's scholarship has opened my eyes to this point, that actually Islam is unique precisely because of that receptivity and that relation to the political. Not
Yeah,
politics, but to the political.
that's it. And that brings us back to last time we talked about political theology. And why is Islam inherently political? Is because it's Muslims, we believe it's the last religion, the last message sent down by Allah or revealed to a prophet. And it requires political action. It requires the building of a community, the building of a life, according to the precepts of this message, right? So it has to be political. It cannot just be left to. And again, we have a hadith in Islam that the Israelites were ruled by prophets, and the Muslims will be ruled by because after the prophet there will be no more prophet, right? He's the last messenger. That they will be ruled by caliphs, right? And of course now that's what I'm saying, where there is no caliph or caliphate or caliphs, it doesn't have to be one. The question is, who rules us then? How do we go about as Muslims living our own lives, right? And this is where there is a trap of individualism, where we just have to absorb liberal consensus and liberal values, which is just mind your own business, be the best version of yourself, do the best that you can, do the right thing, observe halal and haram in your daily life, and that's it. But that is pacifism. That is being passive and not taking political action. That is anti-political, right? Because that's succumbing to the post-political, that we live in a post-political world, that there can be no more politics, that this is it. We live in a cosmopolitan world. We're all consumers. Just when you consume in a halal way. We're all different skin colors, different religions, but underneath our own skin, we're all what? Human. So doesn't matter. We're all the same. But are we all the same? And is it bad that we're different? Because what this assumes is that its differences are not okay, or we want to domesticate differences. So we can be different, but also we want to be comfortable with our own differences. So even like within Christians, for example, like you have like particular Christian communities where people are not comfortable being around them because they're just too different and they do things completely differently. Like, I don't want to be around them. Or like, they have like this stigma around particular cults or religious groups or whatever other groups there are. So for me, the question then, well, how do we do politics, right? And you say, well, for me, I say, at first, if you're not Muslim, it's easier. Because first, it's easier for you to speak freely. It's harder. I mean, we have to acknowledge, as a Muslim, there are the constraints around your freedom of expression. Like I speak here, and I'm very conscious of every word that I say, because I have to be, given, the climate generally. And we just have been trained to be conscious of how we are perceived and how we are interpreted, because we don't want to be accused of being, the wrong kind of, not Muslim, but person, because if you're the wrong Muslim, they also don't even belong anywhere. So you have to be conscious and you have to understand what the limits of your freedom of expression are. And you can go all the way to the limit, but you cannot cross the limit. So we can talk about extreme actions, but we're careful how to talk about those actions. We talk about Hamas, but we're careful how to talk about Hamas and what to say about Hamas and what not. So it's a charged, conversation. When you talk about Islam, it's a charged conversation. When I was working on my thesis, I struggled to find supervisors because very few, actually, there were none willing to supervise me unless I changed my argument and my direction, until I found a Muslim supervisor. And he took on my thesis and he read the first draft or chapter or two, and then he said, I'm only saying this because for him it was inconceivable for anyone to say what I was trying to say. He simply said, it takes a lot of courage to write what you're writing. And I just didn't think. I thought that was just a normal thing to write. Like, I didn't see that I was writing anything completely revolutionary or radical. I was simply trying to provide a real descriptive analysis. But the point is that this is the extent to which Muslims are now engineered and trained to censor themselves, to even when they think. But they still have to perform because, we still have to show that we're Muslim because this is very important to us. So Islam becomes for us a matter of performativity. So we're only performing it in the public sphere as well. So we want to pray, want to, be conscious of our choices, Islamic schools, this and that. But really, I think underneath all of this, there is an anti-political sensibility. And that's what I'm talking about. Like I mentioned, for example, Politics, Law and Community as an example of a book that seems to promote Islamic politics, but really it's an anti-political book.
You're talking about Owamer Anjum's dissertation on Ibn Taymiyyah?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a very interesting book. Yes, so Ibn Taymiyyah is, next to Al-Ghazali, probably the most important of sort of Muslim thinker, polymath, right? The thinker who, I think he wrote poetry. He wrote like he was a jurist, classical figure, but he had a particular conception of how the ummah is to relate to politics. Can you clarify what you mean in this regard? I'd be very curious because I know that you work with Anjum's. You've written, I think, multiple things on his work, and even I think I saw something you wrote on Shahab Ahmed as well, which maybe I could ask you about. But what do you mean on this point in terms of anti-political? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I haven't actually worked with Anjum or published my work on his. I'm still developing a critique of his work, but yeah, I was making a point that this governance politics that just jumps to the governance side, the governance question, the question of governance before it comes to terms with the question of the community.
I see.
When you talk about governance, who do you govern? A community. But first, should not we define the community, understand the community, come to terms with the existence of the community? If the community itself is under existential threat, how can we be so preoccupied with governance questions before we have dealt with the question of war, protection, defense? That is Ibn Taymiyyah's project. But here, what we have in this book is how Ibn Taymiyyah is interpreted in a way that we fixate on his opinions and on his discourse around governance and leave out everything that has to do with his work on jihad. So how can we deal with this those two questions, war/jihad on the one hand, and there is the political as ontological. That's Salman's conception of it. The community. That's Laclau's conception of it. That's Schmidt's conception of it, Carl Schmitt, right? The building of the community, the establishing of borders. Shouldn't we first do this, and then we can preoccupy ourselves with how we govern the community? But it seems that we've taken for granted that we exist, and this is the world we live in. We are Muslims in America. How do we live as Muslims in America? That's the book for me. Or, yeah, how do we enact Islamic politics? But it's governance politics.
Yeah, obviously, I'm not an expert on Islamic theology and these matters, but I have read that book, and I found that the point that's so profound is that he seems to prioritize the consensus of the Ummah over the scholars in such a way which is almost, you could say, radically democratic. I don't mean democratic. I mean that in the kind of broad colloquial sense. So he has a kind of political communitarianism, which is anti-hierarchy as well. There's like a strident criticism of scholarly hierarchy as part of that. But it's been a while since I've read that book. We actually read it in a study group. It was very, very enjoyable. What are your thoughts on this book, which I don't know if folks have read, and I may have asked you this before, but I'd be curious. Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam? Probably the most widely read book in recent years on in intellectual circles regarding Islam. Many critics claim that Shahab Ahmed, who fortunately died, I think, in his late 30s, kind of gives us this cosmopolitan, watered-down, apolitical version of Islam. And Anjum wrote an interesting criticism of his book, by the way. How do you find it, that text, if you are familiar with it?
Yes, I am. I've read it when it first came out. I read it in 2015, I think, or 2016. And the truth is, I see Shihab Ahmad's book and Anjum's book as two faces of the same coin. They're both anti-political books. Shihab Ahmad's book, yes, is a cosmopolitan book. And like you correctly pointed out about Anjum's book, it's a book that is infused with the spirit of democratic pluralism and communitarianism. And let's be honest, perhaps, if there is such a thing, Islamic liberalism.
Interesting. Yeah. But not in the Sufi variety, but Sunni Orthodox orientation.
Islamic political liberalism.
Right.
Political liberalism. So we'll emphasize the political, because again, it's about the community and the individual, and again, the community as the total sum of individuals. That's what the community becomes in that book. But they're both similar in that they're both anti-political, and they don't want to confront the question head on, and that is the question of war, and the question of jihad, and the question of community building and community protection, the ummah, the protection of the ummah. Because what Salman argues, and I follow him in this, is that the Islam, of course, is a after the death of the Prophet, Muslims had appointed a ruler. What is the job of the ruler? To govern, but more importantly, to anchor the community, to give a rooting to the community, to ensure the unity of the community. And how do you ensure the unity of the community? By ensuring, the protection of the community against external threat, against threats to its existence. So be willing to lead. That's the first question always, to lead the armies in war. In Islam, we call it jihad. That's why for me, my thesis on jihad is that jihad is just another name for war in Islam.
Even though you have the metaphorical inner jihad.
No, I'm talking about political jihad. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, for example, Hamas nowadays.
Right, because there is the point that the Prophet says
spiritual struggle.
Well, no. At the end of a war, he says, now we begin the higher jihad. Right?
Which is against the self, the nafs.
Enough.
Yes,
Yes.
of course. And they're connected. That's the thing in Islam, and that's where post-socialism is helpful. That the out and the outer and the inner are continuous with each other. That for you to enact outer jihad, you must first enact it within yourself. How could you enact outer jihad? For example, be willing to face a Merkava, right, in Gaza, if you haven't already enacted jihad within yourself, cleansed yourself, and have prepared yourself for the moment of confronting a Merkava with your naked body, with your bare body. How could a Palestinian fighter do that? How could a Palestinian fighter go stand up in front of an Israeli tank, a Merkava, the tank of God, that's what they call it, which is, you see the sheer size of it. Try and envision that. For me, you have to understand jihad on both sides, in both senses. And that's where jihad is, the outer and the inner, is connected. But again, the point about Islam is that you cannot divorce it from the political. And I think, Shahab Ahmed is very, his book is, it's an
Very
essential
well
read.
researched. Yeah.
It's an essential read for sure.
It's essential. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Particularly his critiques of, like you said, it's very well researched, well referenced. I'm not persuaded by the last part of it, where he talks about the pre-context, the context, and the text. I like his attempt to transcend the limited or the limitation, the reduction of Islam to engagement with the letter of the Quran.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where he brings in Sufism. That's where he brings in Islamic philosophy like Avicenna, Averroes, and all other kinds of Islamic traditions and scholarship within the fold of Islam, the universal fold of Islam.
Right,
But
which is why he says Islam expanded through Shahada primarily. Very interesting.
Actually, that's my argument. That Shahada
doesn't he say this, that like the Sufi what do you call Sufi philosophical amalgam, great phrase, allowed for the expansion of Islam in the East, right? Like east of Istanbul, like up through Iran, beyond down into the border of China, even into some border of India.
Yeah.
It was not the text. Primarily it was the way of life, the experience, the self.
He talks about experiential knowledge,
right,
as opposed to textual knowledge.
Right.
So for him, for example, the Sufi authority talks about sources of authority. So for the literalist or the traditionalists, authority is textual authority. So we take, like for us, whatever the text, the Nas says, goes. That's authoritative. And of course, how do we know what the Nas is through exegesis, tafsir, and hadith. So that's also Talal Asad's point in Anthropology of Islam, the idea of an anthropology of Islam, widely read article. And then he talks about Islamic philosophy, and for him, the source of authority is reason. Of course, imbued or interacting with the Nas, but reason. And of course, here we have Kalam, for example, Ahl al-Kalam, or theological schools like Ash'aris, al-Ash'arites. And here there is the conflict or the dialectic of reason and revelation. So what is the source of authority? Is it revelation? Is it reason? Is it spirituality? That is Sufism's source of authority. So here he tries to go beyond what he calls orthodoxy. He says that Islam is not an orthodoxy. There's no orthodoxy in Islam, he says. Because, Muslims are, Islamic philosophers were Muslim, but they were not Orthodox Muslims. And he says, Or he says, well, if we agree that there is orthodoxy, then Islamic philosophers will be considered heterodox, and Sufis will not be considered orthodox, and so on, which is not convincing, simply because he reproduces what we call, there is no Islam but Islams,
Right.
which
Right.
is, you can say the same thing. There is no America but Americas. There is no Marxism but Marxisms. You
Hmm.
pluralize anything and you think that helps you deal with the problem of essentialism. But of
Right.
course, there is orthodoxy in Islam because Islam has limits, and the limits are shahada. You know,
Yeah, it's very strange though, because like, I mean, I thought that his example of Rumi was interesting because one, I thought that he overdid the point about wine drinking, but he uses that to illustrate what is it, like multiple contradictory positions can be held at one time. So that's true, but your argument is that he ends up kind of negating orthodoxy as a foundational principle, as an organizing principle of Islam, and you're suggesting that actually it should be.
otherwise it wouldn't exist. I mean, because orthodoxy is the limit. When you talk about Islam, if you say there's no orthodoxy in Islam, what you're saying is there is no. Essentially, you're saying there is no Islam. There is every Islam is an orthodox Islam, right? It translates into saying anyone's Islam is a true Islam. Anyone's Islam is
Right.
an Orthodox Islam.
Yeah.
So we dissolve the unitary category of Islam, Islam as a unity, into multiple expressions, into pluralities. But the question for us is, what defines Islam as a universal category as opposed to non-Islam? What is not Islam? Okay, we
Mm.
get that this is Islam and this is Islam. Philosophers as Muslims, Sufis are Muslims, wine drinking Muslims are Muslims. We get it. But what is not Muslim? You know, clearly not everything is Islam, because there are Buddhists, there are Hindus, there are Zionists, maybe Muslims, Zionist Muslims. I don't know.
Not possible.
That's what I'm saying. So, what are the limits? And I say that the limits are the Shahada.
Okay. Yeah.
But the Shahada also requires political loyalty to the Ummah. This is where it again becomes political.
I look forward to reading your work on in this regard. We're hitting the 2 hour mark, and I do want to give you back to your family for the holiday. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you so much for your insights, and I hope that this conversation has shed light on a Palestinian perspective that you don't often hear. Um, Shed light on the role of religion in this conflict in a way that you don't often hear, uh, and many other things. Is there anything that you might say in closing regarding the future of where we might be headed? I know it's difficult to even. I know you're a very humble person. Um, in a certain way, I can never. And it's because of my own experiences, uh, uh, envision the continuation of this for much longer. In my view, we have to bring this to an end, and I do want a ceasefire. I will be honest. I want it to stop. I want it to stop.
Inshallah.
It has to stop. And so, how might this come to be? You've already made a very strong case, and I think it's very convincing regarding the status of this as both a war and as a genocide, and we have to think those things together. um do you have any final thoughts on what we might uh how we might think about this also in a way that's not overwhelmingly pessimistic, given the brutality that the Israelis are doing right now? Is there anything that gives you a sense of resolve or strength in the face of this?
Yeah, it's up and down, Daniel. It's not always, we all go through moments. Sometimes I feel, yeah, we just have to persevere a little bit longer, and that this will all come to an end. And thank you, Monica. And sometimes, yeah, I feel very, yeah, down spirited, and yeah, but I think essentially, I think of it this way: this is a test for all of us. This is what Gaza does to all of us. It's a personal thing. It's an intimate thing for every single one who's interested. That's why, even like here to quote Simone Weil, yeah, she talks about evil as indifference, pure indifference. That's why to be indifferent to Gaza at this point in time, for me, is quite alarming. If you are paying attention, even at the most intimate level, like if you're not taking any action, but you're feeling disturbed, and you're haunted by some images or whatever happens, I think that's important, because Gaza sort of brings this in us, brings us into, again, in connection with ourselves. And I think that's the real test for us. Like, it's a struggle. It's jihad in a sense. You have to struggle against, because we live, and then we always remember Gaza, right? Gaza is always on our minds, just always hovering around our heads. And I think that's important for us. Of course, it should propel us to take action. We should do something, whatever we can. We should speak up. If you're on social media, I think it's important also to be wary of how you interact with social media. But it's important to engage in your own communities, whether online or in person, about Gaza. To bring up this conversation and to ensure, yeah, that people continue to listen, to hear, that they continue to hear and to see Gaza's plight, Gaza's suffering, and Gaza's struggle for humanity and for truth, really.
Mohammed, thank you so much. Eid Mubarak. Thank you for coming on the show. We hope that everything resolves. We pray for your family, and I'm very sorry to hear of the loss. We'll never forget them. They are in our prayers. We'll never forget Palestine. So I wish everyone well. I thank you for listening to this incredible conversation with Mohammed. Thank you guys very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.